"Please don't hurt me. I can't walk," the female CEO begged. Then the single dad changed everything. The woman's voice trembled, echoing through the damp, narrow alley, laced with desperation and raw fear. Rainwater glistened on the cracked pavement, forming puddles around her trembling body. Car headlights flared behind the figure approaching her, casting a long, ominous shadow across the walls, making him appear like a looming monster. The man moved slowly, deliberately, his fists clenched tight, his breathing heavy and ragged. She curled up even smaller, her white suit now smeared with dirt and tears, strands of blonde hair plastered to her face. Her left ankle was clearly badly injured, swollen and twisted at an unnatural angle. She winced, trying to shift her position, but the sharp pain sent fresh tears streaming down her cheeks. At that moment, from around the corner at the end of the alley, another man appeared. He was tall and rugged, carrying a little girl wrapped snugly in a faded yellow raincoat. His clothes looked worn and well-used, his boots were soaked, and his face showed the weariness of a long day. But when he heard the woman's voice, so raw and broken, he stopped dead in his tracks. The little girl stirred in his arms, her voice a soft whisper. "Daddy, is she going to die?" she asked, her voice full of concern. The man gently set her down on the ground, making sure she was steady. "Stay right here," he said to her, his voice soft but firm and unwavering. She nodded obediently, clutching a small, well-loved stuffed rabbit tightly to her chest. Without a moment's hesitation, he stepped forward into the alley. His voice rang out, low and commanding, cutting through the tension. "Step away from her, now!" The man who had been looming over the woman turned around, startled by the sudden interruption. A wave of tension hung heavy in the rain-soaked air, but the stranger's eyes, sharp, steady, and unflinching, were locked directly on him. There was something in that intense gaze that stopped the would-be attacker in his tracks. It wasn't fear, it wasn't rage, just a quiet, unwavering certainty. The aggressor took a step backward, then another, and without uttering another word, he turned and disappeared quickly into the shadows. The blonde woman blinked in disbelief, her breath catching in her throat as the man approached her cautiously. Her limbs trembled uncontrollably, not only from the pain in her ankle, but from the overwhelming shock of the situation. The little girl peeked out from the alley's entrance, her eyes wide with concern, just as lightning flashed dramatically across the sky. Thunder rolled and echoed. The man knelt down beside the woman, his voice now incredibly soft and gentle. "You're safe now. I've got you." She stared up at him, her lips parted slightly, completely unable to speak. She didn't even know his name. But in that moment, everything changed for her. And although she was unable to stand, though she felt broken and bruised both physically and emotionally, she had finally been truly seen. And her life was about to change forever in ways she couldn't yet imagine. Tyler Ford lived on the third floor of a crumbling apartment building, a place where the thin walls seemed to whisper with the echoes of lives long worn out. At just 31 years old, his life had already been clearly divided into two distinct parts: everything before he lost his wife and everything after. 2 years earlier, cancer had taken her quickly and cruelly, leaving a gaping hole in his life. Since then, everything he did, every decision he made, revolved entirely around his daughter, Lily. He worked tirelessly as a washing machine repairman, taking whatever jobs he could find that paid just enough to keep the lights on and put food on the table. Most days he came home smelling of rusted pipes and laundry detergent, but he honestly didn't mind. As long as Lily had her crayons, a warm meal in her belly, and a safe place to sleep at night, he could easily live with the aching joints and the constant worry about late rent notices. There was a time when Tyler had worn a very different kind of uniform, a time when he was a rescue worker, a firefighter paramedic with nerves of steel, and a heart that was trained to run directly toward danger, not away from it. He had a long, jagged scar on his left arm, a permanent souvenir from a burning building where he'd bravely pulled a small girl out of the raging flames. He almost never talked about those days. Some memories, he believed, simply weren't meant to be honored or celebrated. They were meant to be carried quietly, privately. Now, his focus was entirely on carrying his daughter, Lily. She was 6 years old, a bright spark of energy with wild, untamed curls and a giggle that had the magical ability to shake the sadness out of any room. She almost never went anywhere without her battered and well-loved box of crayons. "Colors make things better," she liked to say with absolute certainty. She filled their small apartment with drawings of flowers, rainbows, and stick figures holding hands, creating a world that was tiny, perhaps, but undeniably bright and full of joy. On that particularly rainy night, Tyler had promised Lily a special treat, a hot dog from their favorite corner stand if she behaved herself during their trip to the grocery store. They had just turned down a narrow back alley as a shortcut across the block when they suddenly heard it, a scream, piercing and filled with terror. It was a woman's voice, trembling and pleading for help. That night, Isabel Monroe had absolutely no intention of running, but when her fiancé, David Langston, who was also the CFO of her company, locked the door to their expensive hotel suite behind him and began raising his voice in anger, something inside her simply snapped. For months, he had been relentlessly pressuring her to sign over control of some critical assets in their joint holdings. The marriage itself was part of a cold, calculated business strategy orchestrated by her father to secure even greater dominance in the ever-evolving tech world. But Isabel was simply not built to be kept in a gilded cage. She had finally said no. And when his hand gripped her wrist tightly, she reacted instinctively, grabbing the laptop that contained the incriminating files and fleeing barefoot into the pouring rain. She had never run like that before in her entire life, not through dark, unfamiliar alleys, not with her heart pounding in her chest like a trapped and hunted animal. She slipped on the wet pavement, and her ankle gave way beneath her. She fell hard onto the cold, unforgiving concrete. Still, she instinctively held the laptop tightly against her chest, as if it were her only lifeline in that moment, because, in many ways, it was. Her breath came in ragged gasps. The sharp pain in her leg blurred her vision and made her head spin. Her pristine white designer suit was ruined, torn at the shoulder and completely soaked to the bone. Her phone had been lost somewhere back on the street during her frantic escape, and the man she had once trusted, the man she was supposed to marry, was getting closer. She could clearly hear his determined footsteps echoing behind her, and that was precisely the moment when she saw him. Tyler carried her in complete silence, his face etched with concern. The rain had slowed to a light drizzle by the time they reached his apartment building. Isabel's body trembled uncontrollably from the cold and the lingering shock of the evening. She clung tightly to the laptop against her chest, her grip unyielding even as waves of pain radiated from her injured ankle. Tyler didn't say a word. He simply adjusted her carefully in his arms to shield her even more from the chilling wind. "It's okay," he said finally, his voice gentle and reassuring as he carefully lowered her onto the worn couch in his apartment. "You're safe here now." Lily entered the room a moment later, tiptoeing cautiously through the doorway in her bright yellow rain boots. She held her beloved bunny rabbit securely in one arm and looked at Isabel with wide-eyed curiosity. Her gaze wasn't fearful or judgmental, just intensely serious, the kind of seriousness that only a child can truly possess. Then she tilted her head slightly to one side and asked, "Daddy, why is she crying like me when I miss Mommy?" Tyler froze, completely caught off guard. Isabel's breath hitched in her throat. She turned her face away, as if Lily's simple words had somehow pierced something deep inside her that she didn't even know existed. Her fingers tightened on the edge of the couch, gripping it tightly. She desperately wanted to speak, to explain, but she found that she simply couldn't. "She's just had a hard day, honey," Tyler said softly, his voice filled with empathy. "Sometimes grown-ups cry too, you know." Lily nodded solemnly, then wandered off toward her bedroom, her little rain boots squeaking softly with each step she took. Tyler quickly grabbed a clean towel and wrapped it gently around Isabel's shoulders. "I'll get you something warm to drink. Tea, maybe. Okay?" She nodded mutely in response. He disappeared into the small kitchen. Isabel leaned back against the cushions of the couch, still damp and shivering with cold. Her ankle throbbed painfully, but her heart ached even worse. She had spent countless hours in sprawling penthouses, exclusive luxury spas, and hushed corporate boardrooms lined with expensive mahogany, but none of those places had ever felt quite like this. Small, imperfect, and undeniably worn, but also somehow full of something she couldn't quite name, and that, quite frankly, scared her more than anything else. In the middle of the night, Isabel woke with a sudden start. The room was dark, except for a soft, reassuring glow spilling in from the hallway. Her ankles still pulsed with pain, but it was now manageable, a dull ache rather than a sharp, stabbing sensation. A deep quiet filled the small apartment. There were no sirens wailing in the distance, no threatening footsteps echoing behind her, no one shouting angrily. She sat up slowly, unsure of how long she had been asleep. The warm blanket that had been covering her had slipped off and fallen to the floor. Her laptop, still clutched tightly in her sleep, rested safely by her side. A wave of guilt washed over her, pressing heavily on her chest. She had essentially barged into a complete stranger's life, disrupting everything in her wake. She had absolutely no right to do that. Slowly and cautiously, she rose to her feet, biting back a hiss of pain as her injured foot touched the ground. She limped silently toward the door, hoping to slip away quietly before dawn. No notes, no heartfelt thanks, just a quick, silent disappearance. But as she reached for her shoes, which were neatly placed by the door, she stopped in her tracks. They weren't wet and muddy anymore. They had been carefully dried and meticulously cleaned. The loose sole, which had been flapping precariously, had been stitched back together with clean, deliberate lines. Next to them was a neatly folded towel, fresh and warm from the dryer. And on top of the towel, a small piece of paper. The handwriting was rough and slightly uneven, but undeniably steady and clear. Your foot's not better yet. You can stay here. It's okay. Isabel stared at the note for a long moment, her mind reeling. No conditions attached, no hidden expectations, no price to pay, just simple, unadulterated kindness. She sank slowly to the floor, the small piece of paper trembling in her hand. All her life she had fought tirelessly to prove herself, to be good enough, sharp enough, strong enough to meet the incredibly high expectations that had been placed upon her. But here, in this tiny, unassuming apartment with a broken floorboard near the sink and crayon drawings adorning every wall, she felt something she had never experienced in her towering glass and steel world. She felt accepted for absolutely nothing more than simply being. The first morning after, Isabel woke to the faint whistle of a kettle and the soft, comforting clatter of pans coming from the small kitchen. For a fleeting moment, she thought she was back in her luxurious penthouse, with her personal staff diligently preparing her breakfast according to her precise schedule. But then, her eyes focused on the modest, worn couch beneath her, the simple curtains fluttering gently from a draught, and the colourful drawings proudly taped across the refrigerator. She was definitely not in her old world anymore. Tyler appeared in the doorway, carefully carrying a steaming mug. He placed it gently on the small table beside her. The sharp, invigorating scent of ginger filled the air. "Drink this," he said, his voice calm and soothing. "It'll help with the pain." She sat up slowly, testing her injured ankle cautiously. It still throbbed noticeably, but the swelling seemed to be somewhat less than it had been the night before. She took a small sip of the tea. It was spicy and strong, but oddly comforting. "You made this yourself?" she asked, almost sounding surprised. "Old habit," he replied simply, as he sat down on the edge of the coffee table with a roll of bandages in his hands. "Ginger tea, clean water, steady hands. That's all it really takes sometimes." Without another word, he gently lifted her foot onto his lap. His touch was steady and confident, but also incredibly careful, never lingering inappropriately, never invasive. He carefully removed the old bandage, cleaned the wound thoroughly, and then began to rewrap it with a fresh bandage. Isabel watched him in silence, observing his every move. She had been constantly surrounded by assistants and advisors for years, but none of them had ever truly cared for her like this. Not with such genuine patience, not with such focused attention, and certainly not without expecting something significant in return. "You've done this before," she murmured softly. He nodded once in acknowledgement. "Rescue work, fires, accidents. You learn to keep calm, even when you're falling apart inside yourself." Her eyes softened with understanding and empathy. She wanted to ask him more about his past, but before she could find the right words, he reached for her torn jacket. Pulling a small sewing kit from a nearby shelf, he began threading a needle with practiced ease. "You really don't have to," she started to say, feeling a bit awkward. "I know," he interrupted gently, "but it's definitely worth fixing." The thread he used was a slightly mismatched color, and the stitches were somewhat uneven and imperfect. Still, he worked with such intense focus and quiet determination that something inside Isabel's chest broke open, releasing a flood of pent-up emotion. The tears came suddenly, completely unstoppable. She covered her face with her hands, feeling deeply ashamed of her outburst. Tyler paused in his work, clearly concerned. "Did I hurt you?" She shook her head, her voice breaking with emotion. "No, I'm simply not used to this, being cared for." He didn't push her to explain further. He simply handed her a tissue and said quietly, "Everyone deserves it, even you." That was precisely when small footsteps pattered softly across the floor. Lily appeared in the doorway, her hair in wild, untamed curls, her pajamas covered with brightly colored stars. She held a piece of paper tightly against her chest. Without any hesitation, she walked directly over to Isabel and placed the paper in her lap with a flourish. "This is for you," Lily said proudly, beaming up at her. Isabel carefully unfolded the paper. It was a crayon drawing filled with bright, vibrant colors that seemed to jump off the page. It depicted a tall man with brown hair, a little girl wearing bright yellow shoes, and beside them an empty outline of a woman with golden hair. Visibly confused, Isabel looked up at Lily, her brow furrowed slightly. "Who is this?" she asked gently. Lily smiled sweetly, pointing at the figures in the drawing. "That's you," she said, her voice full of simple certainty. "I left the space empty for a long time, waiting for someone who truly belongs with us. I think it's supposed to be you now." Isabel's throat tightened with emotion. Her hands shook slightly as she held the precious drawing carefully. "Sweetheart," she whispered, struggling to find the right words to express herself. "Why me?" "Because you're here," Lily answered simply, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. "And you look like someone who really needs a family." Isabel let out a sound that was somewhere between a nervous laugh and a heartfelt sob. She pressed the drawing tightly to her chest as tears spilled freely down her cheeks. For so long, her life had been nothing more than a constant battlefield of boardrooms, contracts, and relentless expectations. She had been defined solely by numbers, power, and carefully cultivated appearances. No one had ever truly left a space open for her, only issued demands for what she absolutely must become. Yet here, in this cramped, unpretentious apartment with peeling paint and the joyful sound of a child's crayons scratching across paper, she was finally being offered something she had never even dared to dream of, a true sense of belonging. She looked over at Tyler, who stood silently in the doorway, quietly watching the heartfelt exchange. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes told her everything she needed to know: acceptance, unwavering patience, and a quiet, hopeful anticipation. He dared not speak, afraid of breaking the fragile spell. Isabel turned back to Lily, managing a genuine smile through her tears. "Thank you, sweetheart," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "That's honestly the kindest gift I've ever been given." Lily giggled happily and picked up her box of crayons. "Then I'll make it official," she declared confidently. "Purple dress, right?" Isabel nodded, laughing softly through her tears. "Yes, make it purple." And as Lily carefully filled in the empty outline with bold strokes of vibrant purple color, Isabel felt something finally loosen inside her, something incredibly soft, something wonderfully alive. For the first time in years, she truly felt what it meant to belong. Isabel's ankle was healing slowly but surely. Each morning brought a little more strength, a little less pain. But walking was still noticeably difficult and somewhat awkward. She hated the frustrating feeling of weakness, of constantly needing help from others. But Tyler never once made her feel small or insignificant because of it. He simply offered his arm without a word, letting her lean on him for support as they moved through the small apartment. When she stumbled slightly, he steadied her gently. When she winced in pain, He paused without hesitation. There was absolutely no pity in his actions, just quiet presence and unwavering patience. "Just one step at a time," he would say gently, his voice low and calm. Isabel would simply nod in response, focusing intently on the rhythm of their slow, deliberate movement. Step, breathe, balance. It gradually became their own quiet, unspoken ritual, a steady rhythm of trust that neither of them felt the need to name out loud. One particularly sunny Saturday morning, Lily announced that it was officially time to make pancakes for breakfast. "Daddy makes them okay," she said, with an exaggerated shrug of her small shoulders, "but I bet Isabel makes them fancy." "I wouldn't count on it," Isabel warned with a playful smirk. "I've actually never cooked anything myself in my entire life." Lily's eyes widened in genuine surprise. "Never?" "Nope," Isabel confirmed. "Not even toast." Tyler raised an eyebrow in amusement. "Well, that's definitely about to change," he declared with a smile. They all gathered together in the small kitchen, their elbows bumping playfully as they mixed the batter in a cracked ceramic bowl. Lily stood perched precariously on a chair to reach the counter, her untamed curls bouncing with excitement as she barked out orders like a seasoned chef. "More milk, not too many eggs, and wait for the bubbles before flipping them." Isabel tried her best to follow Lily's detailed directions, but the very first pancake stubbornly stuck to the pan. The second one folded in on itself, becoming a strange, misshapen blob. And the third one somehow managed to catch on fire, sending a thin trail of smoke wafting toward the ceiling. Tyler quickly snatched the pan off the hot burner, waving a nearby dish towel frantically at the smoke. "I think that one's yours," he joked, gently nudging the blackened pancake blob toward Isabel's plate. They all burst into laughter, real, uninhibited laughter that came from deep within their bellies, loud and unguarded. It filled the small kitchen like warm, golden sunlight. When they finally sat down to eat, the pancakes were undeniably uneven. Some were a little burnt around the edges, and others were even slightly raw in the middle. But Lily grinned widely as she took a big bite of hers. "These are definitely dorky pancakes," she declared happily. "But dorky is good." They ate slowly, savoring each bite and letting the golden light pour over the kitchen table. Outside the window, the bustling city continued on, oblivious to their quiet joy. But inside their small world, time seemed to slow down and soften around the edges. Lily chattered excitedly about her day at school, how she had almost won the spelling bee, how her teacher always wore socks with pictures of cats on them, and how she had told all her classmates that Isabel was her maybe new mum. Isabel froze for a half of a second, her eyes meeting Tyler's across the table. He didn't react in any obvious way. He simply reached over and poured more syrup onto Lily's plate as if it were the most natural thing in the world. That evening, after Lily had finally fallen fast asleep, surrounded by her well-loved coloring books and an assortment of plush animals, Isabel and Tyler sat together on the couch, watching the soft, muted flicker of headlights from the street below. The television was turned off. The quiet between them felt comfortable and full, not awkward or empty. Isabel pulled the blanket closer around herself, her body still feeling tired from practicing walking earlier that day. Without even thinking about it, she leaned sideways and rested her head gently on Tyler's shoulder. He didn't move, didn't stiffen up or pull away. She could feel the steady, comforting beat of his heart beneath her cheek, the warmth of his presence grounding her and making her feel safe. "You really don't know," she whispered softly, her voice barely more than a breath. "But you've saved me from so many things." Her voice was barely audible, but he heard her clearly. He didn't turn to look at her, didn't ask her what she meant. He simply said, "I didn't save anyone. I just saw someone who needed help." She closed her eyes, letting his words sink in. That simple answer, quiet, honest, and utterly unheroic, cut through all the carefully constructed noise she had lived with for so many years. No one had ever truly looked at her and seen a person before. They had only seen opportunity, strategy, and potential for success. But Tyler, he had seen someone who was clearly hurting, and instead of simply walking away, he had stayed. And that, she realized with a growing sense of wonder, was what love might actually be. Not grand, sweeping gestures or dramatic declarations, but the simple willingness to stand still with someone until they could find their strength and walk again on their own. It all began with a phone ringing insistently in the hallway, followed by the piercing buzz of the front door, and then the unmistakable sound of a persistent knock. Loud, firm, and far too familiar. Isabel froze, her hands still soapy from washing the dishes. Tyler glanced quickly out the window, then moved swiftly to close the curtain. "Don't move," he said calmly, his voice betraying no emotion. She didn't need to ask any questions. The moment she saw the sleek black car parked conspicuously on the street below, she knew that they had finally found her. Within just a few hours, even more people arrived. A cameraman, a sharply dressed woman in a tight blazer holding a microphone, and a man from the legal department wearing a tie that practically screamed damage control. The sidewalk outside the small apartment building quickly became a low-key spectacle. Tyler stood steadfastly by the door, his arms folded firmly across his chest, his body effectively blocking the peephole. From the bedroom, Lily's voice called out softly, laced with confusion. "Daddy, why are there so many people outside?" "It's okay, honey," Isabel said, trying her best to keep her voice calm and steady. "They're just lost, that's all." Later that evening, as the reporters grew tired and the relentless knocks finally faded into silence, Isabel received a message from the board of directors. It was an offer, and a surprisingly generous one at that. Millions of dollars in new compensation, a full reinstatement to her former position, extensive rebranding, and comprehensive reputation management. All she had to do was come back, sign the carefully prepared papers, smile sweetly for the cameras, and pretend that none of this had ever happened. She stared at the message on her laptop screen for a long time, her mind racing. Then she slowly closed the laptop and walked into the kitchen, where Tyler stood quietly drying a dish with an old checkered dish towel. "I'm not going back," she said, her voice firm and resolute. He didn't look up at her right away, taking a moment to gather his thoughts. "Are you sure about that?" he asked gently. "Yes," she said, her voice unwavering. "I've been offered more money than I could ever possibly spend in a lifetime. But not once, not even once in all those years, did I ever wake up feeling the way I do right here, right now." He finally turned to face her, his eyes serious and searching. "And how do you feel here?" he asked softly. She hesitated for a moment, then answered honestly, "Real, seen, safe." He nodded once, a simple gesture of understanding. That was all he needed to hear. By the following morning, they had packed a single bag with their most essential belongings. Tyler carefully loaded Lily into his old pickup truck and drove them out of the city. down a winding road lined with tall trees that had just begun to turn a brilliant gold with the coming of fall. They eventually arrived at a quiet, secluded farmhouse nestled behind a grove of tall birch trees. It belonged to Tyler's mother, a retired nurse with soft, silver-grey hair and kind, gentle hands that somehow knew how to make anyone feel like a child again. She took one long, appraising look at Isabel, didn't ask any prying questions, and simply said warmly, "There's fresh, warm bread in the oven and a clean bed upstairs. Make yourselves at home." That night, under a breathtaking sky filled with countless stars and an overwhelming sense of peaceful silence, Isabel and Tyler sat together on the front porch steps, a worn quilt draped protectively over their knees. "I used to think I had everything," she said softly, her voice barely audible above the chirping of the crickets. "The fancy titles, the expansive property, the illusion of power." He said nothing, simply waited patiently for her to continue. "And yet," she continued, her voice laced with a hint of sadness, "it was all so hollow. I didn't realize how much of myself I had actually given up, just to be seen as successful in the eyes of others." Tyler took a slow, deliberate sip of his tea, then spoke quietly, his voice filled with understanding. "They only saw your name, not you." She nodded in agreement. "Exactly." He looked out across the open field, his voice barely a whisper. "I know what that's like, to be seen as something you're not." She turned to him, her eyes filled with genuine curiosity. "Tell me," she urged gently. He took a long, deep breath, gathering his thoughts. "There was a fire," he began, his voice becoming slightly strained. "Years ago. A small house. I was the first one on the scene. I managed to pull a little girl out." She could clearly hear the subtle tightness in his voice now, the barely suppressed emotion. "She didn't make it," he continued, his voice filled with a quiet sadness. "I did everything I possibly could, but it simply wasn't enough." She reached out and gently took his hand in hers, offering him a silent gesture of support. "You still carry it with you, don't you?" she asked softly. He nodded in response, his voice thick with emotion. "Every single day." There was no need to say anything more. The silence that stretched out between them was not heavy or uncomfortable. It was a shared silence, honored and respected by both of them. She didn't fill it with empty apologies. He didn't fill it with false bravado. They simply sat there together, their fingers intertwined under the vast night sky. Two people who had each lost something significant in their lives and had now quietly begun to find something else, something new and unexpected. They didn't speak of love or make any grand promises, but when Tyler glanced over at her and she met his eyes without flinching or looking away, they both understood on a deep, unspoken level. They had been waiting for each other in their own separate ways, and neither of them was waiting alone anymore. The boardroom felt colder than she remembered, not necessarily in temperature, but certainly in its overall energy. The polished glass walls, the sterile marble floors, and the cold metal fixtures reflected every stark inch of the space where Isabel Monroe had once commanded attention with just a simple glance. Now she walked with a noticeable limp. Her footsteps echoed in an uneven rhythm, one heel dragging slightly because of her still healing ankle. She wore no expensive designer gown, no flashy diamond accessories, just a simple, clean navy blue suit and a burning determination in her eyes that refused to be extinguished. Every head in the room turned to watch her as she entered. The whispers started almost immediately. She came back. She actually showed up. What on earth is she thinking? But no one dared to stop her. David Langston stood confidently at the front of the room, smug and relaxed in the seat that had once belonged to her. He smirked condescendingly, leaning into the microphone. "Miss Monroe," he said, his voice oozing with false politeness. "How entirely unexpected. I simply assumed that you had finally accepted your place. Off the board." Isabel didn't even flinch. She walked purposefully straight to the center of the room, steadying herself with one hand on the large conference table as she faced the crowd of shareholders, high-level executives, and former allies. Her voice was clear, strong, and unshaken. "I came back to finish this the right way," she declared confidently. David opened his mouth to respond, but she quickly raised her hand, silencing him with a simple gesture. Calm, quiet authority, the kind she used to wield like a finely honed blade. "I may not walk the same way I used to," she said, glancing briefly down at her injured ankle, "but I stand taller now because I finally stand for myself." The room fell completely silent. With a single tap on her laptop, the large screens behind her lit up, displaying a cascade of information. Spreadsheets, emails, confidential memos, all of it streamed into the room, providing irrefutable proof of the fraudulent dealings, manipulated contracts, and widespread internal corruption that had been orchestrated by David and several other members of the board. Gasps of surprise and disbelief broke the tense silence. A few people shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their faces betraying their guilt. Isabel turned slowly, making direct eye contact with every single person in the room. "You all thought I disappeared because I was weak," she said, her voice ringing with conviction. "But I left because I desperately needed the space to remember who I truly was before you all convinced me that I had to be someone else." David stood up abruptly, attempting to regain control of the situation. "This is reckless and irresponsible," he blustered. "Do you even have any idea what all of this could potentially cost you?" She looked at him directly, really looked at him, and saw for the very first time how small and insignificant he truly was. "I do," she said calmly, "and I'm fully prepared to pay it." She pulled a document from her folder and placed it deliberately on the table with unwavering precision. "This is my formal resignation, effective immediately. I'm relinquishing my position, my shares, and every last piece of control you ever thought you had over me." The silence that followed was deafening, like a sudden, intense clap of thunder. "You can keep your board seats, your stock options, your empire built on fear and silence," she added, her voice firm and resolute. "But I will no longer be a part of it." One of the shareholders, an older woman who had mentored Isabel in her early years, leaned forward with concern etched on her face. Her voice cracked with emotion as she whispered, "Why?" Isabel's voice softened slightly, but gained even more strength and conviction. "Because I am not a product to be bought and sold. I am not a brand to be marketed. I am not a bargaining chip in someone else's manipulative game. I am a person, a human being with inherent worth." The older woman nodded slowly, her eyes glistening as she blinked back tears and struggled to maintain composure. David, still standing in disbelief, tried one more time to dissuade her. "You'll regret this decision. You're throwing away everything you've worked for." Isabel gave him one last, unwavering look filled with finality. "No," she said with unwavering resolve. "I'm walking away from something that never truly belonged to me in the first place. A gilded cage that held me captive." She gathered her laptop and folder with quiet grace and dignity. As she walked out of the room, step by limping step, no one dared to try and stop her. Not this time. And when the elevator doors finally closed behind her, she didn't cry. She didn't tremble with fear or regret. She simply exhaled, releasing a lifetime of pent-up tension. Outside, the sun had begun to set, painting the sky with vibrant hues of amber and rose. The city below buzzed with life and energy. Isabel stepped onto the sidewalk, no longer defined by her title as a CEO, but as a woman who had finally chosen herself and her own well-being. And for the first time in many years, her shoulders weren't burdened by the weight of an entire empire, only by her own truth. And that, she realized, was more than enough to carry. When Isabel returned to the apartment, it was exactly as she remembered it. Modest, warm, and filled with a quiet sense of joy and contentment. The late afternoon sun streamed through the kitchen window, casting long golden rays across the floor. On the small balcony, Tyler was crouched beside a planter, patiently helping Lily dig out a wilted marigold flower, their hands covered in dirt and their faces showing complete focus. Isabel stood silently in the doorway, watching them, with her heart overflowing with love and gratitude. She stepped out slowly onto the balcony, her voice soft and tender. "Do you have room for one more in this garden of yours?" Tyler looked up, his face immediately lighting up, not with surprise, but with the calm certainty of someone who had been patiently waiting for her to arrive. He nodded once, a simple gesture that spoke volumes. "Always." Lily ran to Isabel, her cheeks smudged with dirt and a proud grin stretched wide across her face. "We're planting new flowers today. This one's going to be orange. You can pick the next one." Isabel knelt down and dug her hands into the earth with them, feeling the cool soil between her fingers. There, in the quiet and simple act of planting something new and beautiful, she felt her own roots begin to take hold, anchoring her to this new life. Days passed, and Isabel poured all of her energy and passion into something she had only dreamed of doing before. The Lily House, a non-profit organization dedicated to helping women who had been manipulated, abused, or discarded by powerful structures like the one she had bravely escaped. Tyler generously helped build the website for the organization, lending his technical skills and support. Lily insisted on the name, The Lily House, explaining with simple wisdom that flowers grow better when they have sunshine and love. At the very center of the Lily House's mission was this core belief: no one should ever have to earn their safety or beg for basic kindness. The world had failed so many women, and Isabel was determined to help rewrite that story, one life at a time. One evening, after a delicious dinner and a messy but fun round of pancake flipping practice, the three of them curled up together on the couch, enjoying each other's company. Lily nestled comfortably into Isabel's side, with crayons and drawings scattered across the coffee table. The gentle hum of the city drifted in through the open window, creating a peaceful atmosphere. Lily turned to Isabel, her face as serious as ever. "Will you stay here forever?" Isabel looked into her big, hopeful eyes, her heart swelling with emotion. "I drew you into our family already," Lily added, holding up a picture from her pile of drawings. 3 stick figures stood in front of a vibrant flower garden. 1 tall man, 1 little girl, and 1 blonde-haired woman in a bright dress. "I don't want to erase you later." Isabel's throat tightened with emotion. She pulled Lily close and whispered, "If you ever need me, sweetheart, I'll always be here for you, no matter what." Later that night, Tyler found her standing on the balcony, gazing out over the twinkling city lights. "I have something for you," he said softly, stepping to stand beside her. From his pocket, he carefully pulled out a small bracelet woven from multicolored threads. It was slightly uneven, but clearly handmade with love. Isabel took it gently, admiring the intricate details. "Lily made it," Tyler explained with a warm smile. "She called it a commitment bracelet. She said it's not a wedding ring, but she was wondering if maybe you'd want to be an unofficial mum first." Isabel's laugh caught in her throat, turning into a tear of joy. She slipped the bracelet onto her wrist. It fit perfectly, as if it had been made just for her. "For the first time in my life," she whispered, her voice filled with emotion, "I feel like I've been chosen, just for being me." Tyler took her hand, intertwining their fingers. They didn't need grand declarations of love or promises. Everything that truly mattered was already planted and growing. In the garden they tended together, in Lily's infectious laughter, in the tiny threads of a bracelet made with pure hope. In the months that followed, Isabel's days were filled with healing, both hers and others. The Lily House flourished, becoming a haven filled with inspiring stories of resilience as women found their footing again and children smiled for the first time in months. Isabel spoke passionately at community events, worked late into the night with dedicated volunteers, and always returned to the apartment, which had truly become her home. One morning, Lily ran in from the balcony, proudly holding up a fresh drawing. "Look!" she beamed with excitement. "It's us planting flowers. It's our forever garden." Isabel knelt beside her and kissed her cheek. "Yes, sweetheart, it's exactly that." In the gentle hum of everyday life, in shared breakfasts, dirty hands working together in the garden, and quiet nights spent reading bedtime stories, Isabel had finally found a sense of peace and belonging that no corporate title could ever have given her. She wasn't just safe and secure, she was truly seen and understood. She was loved, not for her power or accomplishments, but because she had chosen to stay and had been chosen in return. Sometimes, family isn't something you're simply born into. It's something you build, one act of kindness and love at a time. Isabel didn't just walk away from power. She walked towards something real and lasting. A little girl who believed in her unconditionally, a man who never asked her to be anything other than herself, and a life where love didn't come with conditions, only choices. If this story touched your heart, please don't forget to like, comment, and share it with someone who might need a little bit of light in their day. And if you believe in the power of love, healing, and second chances, subscribe to Kindness and Love Tales, because every week we bring you stories that remind us that kindness is the richest love story of all.